9 minutes past noon on the 9th of February 1945, North Sea. Somewhere beneath the grey winter surface, 2 nautical miles west of the island of Fedje on Norway's western coast. The control room of HMS Venturer was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a boat running smoothly, but the compressed, held-breath quiet of a crew that had been listening for 3 hours and was now waiting for an outcome they couldn't predict. The electric motors hummed at low revolutions. Battery levels were declining. Every man aboard knew the window for action was closing. At the chart table, 25-year-old Lieutenant Jimmy Launders had spent the last 3 hours constructing a firing solution from something most submarine commanders had never attempted to build one from: a sound. A diesel engine, misfiring and irregular, somewhere in the water ahead of him. No periscope picture, no clean angle on the bow, no rangefinder measurement. Just the hydrophone bearing, a direction, not a distance, and the rate at which that bearing had been changing as the 2 submarines moved relative to each other. And the zigzag. He had the zigzag. At 12:12 p.m., Launders ordered all 4 bow torpedo tubes fired. Not at a target he could see, at a position. At where the geometry told him U-864 would be when the torpedoes arrived. 4 weapons left the tubes in succession, set at variable depths, the second pair deeper than the first, each separated by roughly 17 seconds. 4 minutes later, the sound that came back through Venturer's hydrophones wasn't another torpedo. It was the sound of a submarine hull failing catastrophically. Popping rivets, tearing metal, and then silence. U-864 was in 2 pieces on the seabed, 155 meters below. All 73 men aboard were dead. No submarine commander had ever done this before. Tracked a submerged enemy for hours on passive bearings. Components of firing solution against a target he couldn't see, moving in 3 dimensions, executing evasive maneuvers whose next iteration he had to predict rather than react to. And gotten it right. None has done it since. The sinking of U-864 is the only confirmed case in the history of naval warfare in which one submerged submarine deliberately killed another submerged submarine. Understanding exactly how it happened requires understanding 2 things: what U-864 was carrying, and what kind of man was holding the stopwatch in Venturer's control room. HMS Venturer was a standard boat. That is the most important thing to establish before anything else. She was a V-class submarine, pennant P-68, laid down at Vickers Armstrong's yard at Barrow-in-Furness on 25th of August 1942, launched on 4th of May 1943, and commissioned into Royal Navy service on August 19th, 1943. Her crew numbered 37, officers and ratings, living in the compressed steel tube of a coastal patrol vessel. 4 bow torpedo tubes, 4 reloads, a 3-inch gun on deck, 3 machine guns, maximum surface speed of 13 knots, no special sensor fit, no experimental equipment. The hydrophone gear aboard Venturer was the same type fitted to every other V-class submarine in the flotilla, a passive listening device that could tell you what direction a sound was coming from, but nothing about how far away it was. The ASDIC, the British active sonar system, was standard issue. What the V-class boats didn't carry, and what the Americans had developed separately for their own fleet, was a dedicated fire control computer. British submarine commanders solved the torpedo mathematics manually with plotting tables, paper, and whatever arithmetic they could sustain under pressure. Venturer's record before February 1945 was formidable. In the 12 months ending in February 1945, she had sunk 13 German vessels during 10 patrols operating off the Norwegian coast. The most recent kill was the Type 7C U-boat U-771, sunk on November 11, 1944, off the Lofoten Islands. A textbook submerged approach, periscope acquisition, clean firing solution, torpedo strike. That engagement earned Launders his first Distinguished Service Order, with a citation commending courage, skill, and undaunted devotion to duty. What Launders was known for among those who served with him, and within the submarine service more broadly, was confidence in his calculation, not just bravery, arithmetic. His ability to build a mental model of a tactical problem and solve it correctly. His colleagues in the submarine service described him as, among other things, a boy wonder with a genius for mathematics. That reputation was about to be tested in conditions no submarine commander had ever faced. U-864 wasn't a boat designed for the North Sea. She was a Type 9D2, the largest operational U-boat type in the German fleet by 1944, 87.5 meters from bow to stern, displacing 1,799 tons when fully submerged. Powered on the surface by 2 MAN diesel engines and 2 auxiliary MWM cruising diesels, producing 9,000 horsepower, giving her a surface speed of nearly 21 knots. Her designed range at cruising speed was 12,750 nautical miles, enough to reach the Far East without refueling. That was the plan. Operation Caesar, codenamed Unternehmen Kaiser in German files, was a technology transfer mission to Japan. What U-864 carried wasn't a weapons system. It was the components of weapons systems, bundled with the people who could explain how to build them. Her primary cargo, per the verified manifest confirmed by the Det Norske Veritas survey of the wreck in 2008, parts and engineering drawings for Messerschmitt jet fighter aircraft, including components associated with advanced German aviation programs. V2 missile guidance hardware from Peenemünde. The intention was to give Japanese engineers both the components and the knowledge to attempt domestic production of jet-propelled aircraft and guided rocket weapons. Technology that, in early 1945, remained genuinely beyond Japan's independent development capacity. Among the passengers, Messerschmitt engineers who were to oversee knowledge transfer in Japan, and Japanese technical specialists returning from Germany. These weren't passengers in the ordinary sense. They were the human component of the technology transfer, the people who could turn components and blueprints into working systems. And then the secondary cargo. Stored in the keel, packed into 1,857 individual carbon steel flasks, each one weighing approximately 32 kilograms, 67 metric tons of liquid mercury. Japan had been purchasing mercury from Italy in volume, roughly 1,500 short tons, between 1942 and September 1943, when Italy's surrender cut off that supply. Mercury was essential to the manufacture of explosive primers, the detonating elements inside shells, bombs, and torpedoes. Japan's stocks were finite. U-864's keel load was a strategic resupply that, if it had arrived, would have sustained Japanese weapons production for an extended period. U-864 had left Kiel on December 5, 1944, on her maiden operational voyage. She ran aground in the Kiel Canal almost immediately, damaging her hull and requiring diversion to Horten Naval Base near Oslo for initial repairs. By the time she reached Bergen, it was January 5, 1945. 3 weeks behind schedule and still not fully operational. On January 12, 1945, while Wolfram's crew was still working through the repair list in Bergen's reinforced U-boat pens, the RAF arrived. 32 Lancaster bombers from 9 and 617 squadrons dropped tallboy bombs on the facility. At least one bomb penetrated the bunker roof. One pen was put out of service for the remainder of the war. U-864 herself escaped direct hits, but the raid cost more time. Korvettenkaptein Ralph Reimar Wolfram was 32 years old, born in the port city of Wilhelmshaven on March 31, 1912. A career naval officer since 1930. He had previously commanded U-108. His combat record, by the time he took U-864 out of Bergen in February 1945, showed no torpedo victories. Operation Caesar was effectively his first operational patrol. He knew the procedures. He knew the doctrine. What he was now trying to do was get a large, barely repaired boat with a mechanical problem across the North Sea and into the open Atlantic without being killed. On February 6th, with repairs apparently complete, Wolfram cleared Bergen, heading south and west. One of U-864's diesel engines was still misfiring. Irregular detonation creating an acoustic signature that stood out against background noise in a way a properly maintained engine wouldn't. He passed through the Fedje area that day without incident. Then the engine problem worsened. He radioed Bergen. Bergen told him an escort would meet him at Helisoy on the 10th of February. He turned back. That single decision reversed his course directly back toward Fedje, toward the area where 2 days earlier a British submarine had arrived with instructions to find him. The Admiralty signal directing HMS Venturer to the search area had been specific in its imprecision. Important secret U-boats probably use following routes: from 60 degrees 40 minutes north, 004 degrees 26 minutes east, course 110 degrees R/V off Helisoy 1. Probable that U-boats proceed to seaward off RV. Bletchley Park had been reading German naval Enigma traffic throughout the war. The communications about Operation Caesar's delays, the grounding, the Bergen repairs, the RAF raid, the continuing mechanical problems, were decrypted as they were sent. The Admiralty knew a German submarine with a strategic cargo was somewhere between Bergen and the open Atlantic, running behind schedule with engine trouble. They directed Venturer to search the most probable route corridor. Venturer had departed Lerwick in the Shetland Islands on February 2, 1945, beginning her 11th war patrol. She moved south and east toward the Norwegian coast, electric motors running quietly at patrol depth, watching and listening. Launders had made one key decision before beginning the search. He wouldn't use active ASDIC, the sonar ping that gives range to any contact but also announces your presence to anyone within listening range. Instead, passive hydrophone only. The logic was clear. Active sonar would alert U-864 to Venturer's position before Launders had time to develop a firing solution. The cost was that passive hydrophone provides bearing without range, direction, not distance. At around 9:32 in the morning, on 9th of February 1945, Venturer's ASDIC operator noticed something. A faint hydrophone effect, HE in Royal Navy notation, passive acoustic contact from a vessel's engine noise. He reported it. Launders ordered closer attention. The contact faded. Around 45 minutes after that first detection, it returned. Louder, unmistakable. A diesel engine, irregular, definitely mechanical rather than biological. The bearing wasn't resolving from the surface. It matched a misfiring marine diesel running through a submerged snorkel pipe. With Venturer moving slowly to develop the geometry of the contact, the officer of the watch, scanning through the periscope at the low winter horizon, spotted something. A thin mast, barely visible above the chop. Not a periscope. The shape was wrong, thicker, more angular, with a bend in it. A snorkel. U-864 was running on her diesels at periscope depth, the snorkel mast raised to draw air and vent exhaust gases, keeping her submerged while her main engines turned. Backplotting the geometry afterward put the mast at approximately 5,000 yards. Launders now had two things: a passive bearing and, from the snorkel sighting, an approximate depth. The snorkel mast's visible height above the waterline gives a rough indication of the submarine's keel depth. A boat running with her snorkel just breaking the surface is at a predictable depth, give or take the sea state. It wasn't a precise measurement, but it was better than nothing. What he did next defined the next 3 hours. He secured the periscope, switched off active ASDIC, and went back to passive-only hydrophone tracking. The snorkel sighting was a single fix, not a continuous track. From this moment, the only information flowing into Venturer's plotting table would come from the bearing rate. The rate at which U-864's bearing changed as the two boats moved. That data would have to be enough. He also went to action stations. Not to fire. Not yet. To listen. 3 hours is a long time to track a sound. Launders held his crew at controlled readiness, suppressing the instinct to act in favor of the discipline to observe. He needed data more than he needed speed. The hydrophone bearing came in continuously, updated as often as the operator could report it, and at the chart table the track was plotted in pencil. Each bearing fix, time-stamped, the accumulating curve of U-864's movement through the water ahead. A submarine using only hydrophone tracking can't determine range directly. What bearing rate provides is relative motion. How fast the angle to the target is changing, which is a function of the target's speed, own ship speed, and the geometry between them. With careful plotting over time, multiple bearing observations, own ship position precisely known, the changing rate of bearing change, a skilled navigator can develop an estimated track. What course and speed most consistently explain the observed bearing data? Launders was doing this continuously, and what the track was showing him, with increasing clarity as the hours passed, was that U-864 wasn't maintaining a straight course. Her bearing rate was periodically disrupted in a pattern that wasn't random. The boat was zigzagging. The change registered in Venturer's hydrophone plot as a periodic distortion in the bearing rate. When a target holds a steady course, its bearing rate has a predictable mathematical character, gradual and consistent. When it turns, the bearing rate changes abruptly, then settles again on the new heading. A systematic zigzag produces a regular alternating pattern. Course one direction, steady rate, then a turn, different rate, then another turn. The pattern was becoming readable. A submarine suspected of being followed would adopt evasive maneuvers as a matter of standing doctrine. A boat running a systematic zigzag is dramatically harder to attack than one on a consistent heading, because the attacker can't know which direction the target is heading when the torpedoes arrive. The zigzag interval and amplitude matter less than the simple fact of the changing course, or so the doctrine assumed. The doctrine assumed an attacker with minutes to develop a solution, not hours. Launders was watching each course change register in his bearing rate data. He noted the timing, how long between turns. He noted the approximate amplitude, how large an angular change each turn represented. Over the first hour, the pattern was ambiguous. A zigzag needs several iterations before its structure becomes clear. Over 2 hours, it was becoming characterizable. By the third hour, Launders had something that no attacking submarine commander had ever had before: a statistically reliable description of an enemy submarine's evasive maneuver, accumulated through patient passive observation over extended time. His batteries were declining. The 3-hour submerged pursuit had consumed electrical reserves that Venturer needed for maneuverability. He couldn't wait indefinitely. U-864 wasn't going to surface. She had snorkel capability and was using it, and her crew apparently understood they were in a contested area. Waiting for an easy surface shot wasn't an option. The decision crystallized: attack or abort. If he attacked, he had to attack without a single current observation of the target. Not a metaphor for incomplete information, but a literal description of a torpedo solution computed entirely from estimated inputs and bearing data against a vessel he couldn't see, at a depth he could only infer, on a heading he had to predict. To understand why this was genuinely unprecedented, it helps to understand what a torpedo attack normally required. In a standard engagement against a surface ship in 1945, a British submarine commander used a procedure refined through years of doctrine and training. He raised the periscope periodically, briefly to minimize the visible profile, and took observations. Each observation gave him the target's bearing and its apparent angle on the bow, the angle between the target's length and the line of sight to the attacker. From successive observations, he could estimate the target's course and speed. A range-finding reticle in the periscope allowed him to measure distance based on the known height of the target's masts or superstructure. A manual fire control calculator, British crews called it the fruit machine, processed bearing, range, and speed against own course and speed to produce a firing angle offset, the amount by which the torpedo needed to lead the target. Then he set the torpedo running depth and waited for the geometry to come right before ordering the shot. Every element of that process depended on visual contact. Remove the periscope observation and the system fails. Range can't be determined. Course can only be estimated with large uncertainty. Depth is unknown. And if the target is actively maneuvering, the bearing angle at the moment of firing is only the starting point of a more complicated prediction problem. Against U-864, Launders had no rangefinder observation. He had an estimated track built from bearing rates over 3 hours, not a plotted range. He had an approximate depth from a snorkel mast observation made hours earlier, useful but not a current fix. He had an estimated course, subject to the uncertainty inherent in bearing-only tracking. And the target was zigzagging. This is the specific technical reason the engagement was considered impossible by the standards of 1945 doctrine. The consensus inside submarine communities, expressed in training, in professional discussion, in the assumptions that shaped what commanders were taught to attempt, was that a submerged torpedo attack against another submerged target wasn't a practical proposition. Too many unknowns, too many dimensions, no reliable way to compute a firing solution without direct observation of the target. What Launders proposed to do was compute that solution differently. Instead of firing at where U-864 was, he would fire at where U-864 was going to be. Instead of solving for a moving target from a current observation, he would solve for a target whose movement was governed by a pattern he had spent 3 hours characterizing. The 4 torpedoes weren't fired as a simple spread, a fan across a range of bearings, hoping one connects. They were set deliberately. First pair at shallower depth, second pair deeper. The shallow pair would intercept U-864 if she maintained approximately her current running depth. The deeper pair was set for the depth she would reach if she executed a crash dive in response to hearing the first 2 weapons enter the water. Launders was firing at 2 possible futures simultaneously. Whichever one Wolfram chose, a torpedo would be there. The manual calculation that produced these settings, the bearing rate data, the estimated speed, the inferred depth, the predicted zigzag timing, was done at the chart table without mechanical assistance. Launders and his officers worked it through in the final minutes before the order to fire, checking the geometry, committing to the estimate. There was no way to validate the solution against a current observation. The inputs were estimates all the way down. At 12:12 p.m., Launders decided the estimates were good enough and gave the order. Below the surface, in U-864, the engagement must be reconstructed from the outside. There were no survivors. What British attack records, the patrol report, and the physical evidence of the wreck allow us to establish is this. U-864 was maintaining her systematic evasive pattern over those 3 hours without knowledge that Venturer was methodically characterizing it. The snorkel was operational, the diesels running. A diesel-driven submarine is far noisier on its own equipment than an electric-running one, and that engine noise severely degraded U-864's own passive hydrophone capability. The misfiring cylinder that had made Wolfram's boat so acoustically detectable to Venturer was simultaneously masking the sounds of Venturer's quiet electric motors from U-864's hydrophone operators. This information asymmetry was decisive. Venturer, running on electrics at low speed, was acoustically quiet. Her hydrophones were functional and unmasked. U-864, running her diesels through the snorkel, was acoustically loud and partially deaf to what was happening around her. The first indication Wolfram had that something was catastrophically wrong was the sound of torpedoes entering the water. Incoming weapons produce a characteristic noise detectable on hydrophones even through engine interference. The whirring of propellers, the cavitation of the running gear, if they are close enough. He ordered an immediate crash dive. Drop the snorkel, disengage the diesels, engage the electric motors, drive the diving planes down. U-864 was a Type 9D2, a long, heavy, ocean-going boat built for range, not agility. Her submerged speed under electrics was 6.9 knots. Dropping from snorkel running depth to any significant depth increase took time. The hull had to move through the water, driven by diving planes against the boat's inherent positive buoyancy. Her length, 87 meters, made rapid course changes slow to execute. A Type 9D2 isn't a boat that pivots. The first 3 torpedoes passed. Wolfram's crash dive took U-864 below their running depth. His instinctive defensive response had worked, as it would work against almost any opponent who had fired at where U-864 was rather than where she was going. The 4th torpedo was already at the depth U-864 was diving toward. The strike was amidships. At that depth, the external water pressure against a breached pressure hull was overwhelming. The boat didn't flood gradually. It imploded. The structural integrity of the pressure hull collapsed inward under differential pressure, the riveted steel failing along its stressed points. The central section of the hull effectively disintegrated. The bow section separated from the stern. Both sank. From inside Venturer, the hydrophones recorded what followed. The sound of a submarine hull giving way. Then the long, subsiding acoustic signature of a vessel descending. Launders dived Venturer immediately to avoid any counterfire. None came. There was nothing left to fire. The wreck of U-864 sat undiscovered on the seabed for 58 years. It was found in March 2003 when the Royal Norwegian Navy minesweeper HMS Venturer, alerted by local fishermen who had noticed anomalous sonar returns while working the area, located and identified the contact. An expedition in October 2003 mapped the seafloor by sonar. The picture that emerged confirmed what the British Patrol Report had recorded 5.5 decades earlier. U-864 lies in two major sections, bow and stern, with the centre section essentially missing, replaced by 107 debris fragments scattered across the wreck site. An ROV survey in August 2005 documented the distribution. The bow section rests on a slope at 155 metres. The stern lies at 177 metres. The gap between them is where U-864 ceased to exist. This physical distribution is consistent with a torpedo strike, followed by catastrophic pressure hull implosion, breaking the boat at its weakest structural point. The wreck confirms the kill. It can't tell us whether Launders' bearing plot was accurate to 50 yards or 200, or what precise heading Wolfram was on when the weapon found him. The seabed geometry is proof of outcome, not proof of method. What the British Patrol Report describes, a bearing plot, a predicted position, a spread across estimated depths, the wreck validates, without providing the granular intermediate steps. What the wreck did reveal, when Norwegian Coastal Administration divers began detailed survey work, was that U-864's secondary legacy would long outlast the war. The 1,857 carbon steel flasks carrying 67 metric tons of mercury had been sitting at 155 metres for 60 years when they were examined. The original canister walls were 5 millimetres thick. Recovered canisters showed walls corroded in places to 1 millimetre. Mercury was leaking into the surrounding sediment at approximately 4 kilograms per year. By 2005, the contaminated zone measured roughly 30,000 square metres of seabed. Norwegian authorities found elevated mercury levels in cod, cusk and edible crab caught near the site. Fishing near the wreck has been prohibited since 2006. The Norwegian government spent the better part of 2 decades deciding what to do. Salvage was discussed, contracted, then postponed. U-864's live torpedoes, its physical instability at depth, and the risk of spreading contamination during a lift operation made any straightforward remediation dangerous. In May 2016, the Norwegian Coastal Administration installed a counterfill on the slope below U-864's bow section. 200,000 tons of crushed rock, placed with precision by a specially equipped dredging vessel through a flexible fall pipe, to stabilize the slope and prevent the hull from sliding further and distributing contaminated sediment over a wider area. In 2018, the government decided the wreck would ultimately be capped in clean fill where it sits. As of 2024, Norwegian authorities were planning to retrieve accessible portions of the mercury cargo in 2026, before the final capping proceeds. U-864 is also a war grave. The remains of all 73 men are distributed across the wreck and its debris field. Norwegian maritime law and international convention govern any work conducted near the site. Environmental remediation must proceed within protocols that apply to such graves. Protocols that exist precisely because 20th century warfare left too many ships, too many submarines, too many dead on the bottom of the world's oceans, with their cargoes still aboard. The engagement between HMS Venturer and U-864 occupies a curious place in historical memory. In professional submarine circles, it has never been obscure. The US Naval Submarine League published a dedicated account in 1993 under the title Submarine versus Submarine Submerged, the only actual sinking, recognizing the kill's unique status in tactical history. Norman Friedman's British Submarines in Two World Wars, the standard technical reference on the subject, covers it as a landmark event. Ian Ballantyne's Hunter Killers calls it the only one of its kind without qualification. The Guinness World Records lists U-864 as the first submarine sunk by another submerged submarine. In February 2025, the crew of the new Type 31 frigate HMS Venturer held a formal commemoration of the 80th anniversary. The Royal Navy noted that the action remains relevant in the 21st century. In general British public war memory, it's almost entirely unknown. Several structural factors account for this. Submarine warfare resists the format of popular history. There are no photographs of a kill made entirely underwater. There is no dramatic footage. The engagements happen invisibly, at depth, with no survivors on one side and no visual evidence of the outcome until a wreck is found decades later. The Battle of the Atlantic is the most important naval campaign of the war in strategic terms and the least cinematic in popular terms. Submarines sinking ships in the dark doesn't generate the kind of imagery that burns itself into cultural memory. The Norwegian theatre was secondary in British public consciousness. Fedje isn't Dunkirk, not Malta, not Normandy. Operations along the Norwegian coast were strategically necessary, denying Germany the coastal shipping routes, intercepting U-boats transiting to the Atlantic. But they didn't generate the concentrated public attention that came with the great set-piece battles. The enigma dimension meant the engagement couldn't be discussed accurately in public for decades after the war. The intelligence that sent Venturer to the Fedje area derived from decrypted German naval communications. The existence of Bletchley Park's Enigma operation remained classified until 1974. Accounts of the engagement that appeared before then had to omit the intelligence context entirely, leaving the story of how Venturer came to be in exactly the right place unexplained, and therefore harder to tell completely. And there were no survivors from U-864 to provide the drama of capture, of men hauled from the water, of an adversary humanized by survival. There was the sound of a hull breaking apart on a hydrophone, the silence that followed. And then, for the next 58 years, nothing visible to look at. When the wreck was located in 2003, the story returned to public attention, but the angle was environmental rather than historical. Mercury contamination near Fedje made Norwegian headlines. The fact that the contamination came from a German submarine sunk by a British one in a historically unique engagement was secondary detail in coverage focused on the regulatory and ecological problem. Inside the submarine service, the achievement was formally recognised from the beginning. A brass model torpedo was presented to Launders, inscribed as marking the first recorded instance of its kind. That object sat at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport as physical evidence that the institution understood from the moment the patrol report was filed what had happened on February 9th, 1945, and why it differed from anything that had come before. What Launders achieved on February 9th, 1945 wasn't a lucky shot. That framing inverts the causality. A lucky shot is one where the attacker fires without an adequate solution and happens to connect anyway. What Launders did was construct an adequate solution to a problem doctrine said was insoluble, and execute it cleanly. He had 3 hours of passive bearing data. He had a characterized zigzag pattern. He had an estimated depth from a snorkel observation, an estimated speed from bearing rate mathematics, and an estimated track from careful plotting. The uncertainties were real. He couldn't know the exact range, the exact depth, the exact heading at the moment of firing. But he had reduced those uncertainties to the point where a spread of 4 torpedoes at variable depths set against the predicted position of a boat running a known evasive pattern carried a realistic probability of success. He also understood something about what would happen when the first torpedoes entered the water. He knew, because any competent submarine commander would know, that hearing incoming weapons produces an instinctive response. Dive deeper. Change course. He had anticipated that response and preset his second pair of torpedoes to intercept the depth Wolfram would reach in executing it. The defensive action Wolfram had been trained to take became the terminal mechanism. The bar to Launders' DSO, gazetted 24th April 1945, described the achievement in characteristically spare language. For gallantry, judgment and skill in a successful patrol. 3 words of qualification. Among them, 1 word precisely chosen. Judgment. Not luck. Not courage alone, though courage was required. Judgment. The exercise of trained analytical capacity under pressure against incomplete information to a correct conclusion. Every zigzag correction Wolfram had made during those 3 hours had done 2 things simultaneously. It had moved U-864 away from where she had been, the standard defensive function of the maneuver. And it had confirmed another data point in Launders' characterization of the pattern. Each repetition of the evasive sequence narrowed Launders' uncertainty about when the next turn would come. What Wolfram believed was protecting him was simultaneously building the dataset that made him killable. This is the precise thing that makes the engagement philosophically distinct from every other torpedo attack before it. In any normal attack, the attacker reacts to the target's present position. Here, the attacker predicted the target's next position by modelling the target's own defensive behaviour. Wolfram wasn't killed by a torpedo aimed at where he was. He was killed by a torpedo aimed at where his own training told him to go. That is a different kind of warfare. It began off Fedje Island on February 9th, 1945, when Jimmy Launders looked at 3 hours of bearing rate data and decided he understood the man on the other end of it better than that man understood his own situation. HMS Venturer's torpedoes were standard issue. Her hydrophone was the same fit installed in every V-class submarine in service. Nothing about the equipment that day was exceptional. What was exceptional was what a 25-year-old lieutenant did with 3 hours of degraded, range-free bearing data. A firing solution constructed not from what he could see, but from what he had calculated his enemy was about to do. U-864 is still there, 2 nautical miles west of Fedje Island. The mercury is still leaking. The Messerschmitt engineers never made it to Tokyo. And the patrol report that described what happened, dry, precise, signed by Launders and filed with the Admiralty within weeks of the engagement, sits in the National Archives at Kew, where anyone willing to look can read the original account of the first time one submerged submarine ever killed another. Subscribe for more stories like this.